Hello, and welcome to Research Chatter, a podcast sponsored by the Strategic Management Society. I'm your co-host, Ronnie Chatterji from Duke University in North Carolina, and I'm joined by Charlie Williams from Bocconi University in Milan. This is our second episode of Research Chatter. The purpose of the series is to highlight big ideas from business school professors across the world. Our sponsor, SMS, is always looking for new ways to connect scholarship to practice, and this podcast is just one experiment in doing so. In each episode, we're going to focus on one topic where business school professors are uncovering new insights about real-world problems. Our goal is to speed up the translation process from ideas to action. Last time, we talked about the rigor and relevance of the latest research on business accelerators. We got great feedback from many of you in person at AOM and via email and Twitter. Please keep them coming. Today's episode focuses on another fertile area of strategy research. Do management practices and management matter? Wait, Charlie, don't we already know that they definitely do? Or wait, maybe it's that they definitely don't. What I try to say is, haven't we been studying this for years?
Hey, Ronnie, thank you. And yes, it is good to be back here, and it was really nice to hear from some people at Academy who listened to the podcast to have some comments. So, and yes, I think scholars in management and strategy, certainly one of the reactions has been, wait a minute, haven't we been studying this already forever? But what these new scholars have brought to this was this interesting mix, in a sense, of naivete about what's out there already in terms of management research, but really well-informed idea of what management best practices are in manufacturing. And they've taken that to surveys and studies of management practice in a wide variety of fields, and have really pushed forward, but driven more by this economics interest in deep issues of economic progress, and really motivated by the feeling that still the economics hasn't fully captured what is driving economic progress across different countries. So there's been this study of productivity in different countries for a long time. In economics, productivity is really measured as the residual of production, what can't be explained by how much labor and capital you're using. And for a long time, that sort of was the cutting edge. Measuring this total factor of productivity through this residual was controversial at first, and then widely accepted. And the first cut through on this was that hard technology, real technology adoption, could explain a lot of what was left over. And in fact, innovation and technology use does explain a lot, but there's still a lot of the productivity puzzle left to be explained. And these scholars have come along and said, management of firms, and especially large firms, might well explain another big portion of that. So so they've turned to it with this sort of curiosity, and then these powerful models that basically do this baseline of a production function with capital and labor, and then learn a lot through the comparison of adding things like technology and management to the production function. So I'm curious what you think as well, Ronnie. What do you think about this new meeting of economics and management practice in scholarship?
Well, this is what I think is so interesting about what Nick Bloom and John Van Reenen and Raphael Sandun and some of their co-authors are doing. They're taking an old topic. We've studied management and management practices for a long time in business schools, but they're giving it a new twist. And I think that the creative approach they've been doing, especially building new data sets through surveys, has really opened up a whole set of questions that we can start to answer. And I think what's exciting for them is they're also getting economists very interested in management practices. In one of their early papers, I think it's one of the review papers, they talk a lot about sort of the early economists identifying management practices as really important, but over time realizing they were really difficult to study. And I think what you have with Bloom, Van Reenen, and Sandun are emissaries, people who can speak to economists, who have their foot in the economics camp, but also, are in business schools in some cases and able to take what they've learned in business schools and translate that into sort of economics research. And I think that's a really powerful combination. So I think this kind of work is really good, not just for economics, but also for strategy and management. I think it's less about, who discovered that management mattered or management practices are important, but the contribution that Bloom, Van Reenen, and Sandun are doing to advancing our collective understanding of management practices and management. So I think that's nothing but a good thing. Charlie, it's interesting. When you see people working at the intersection of different fields, you often hear grumblings on both sides. Some folks might say, hey, look, didn't we already know this? You're not discovering something new. And on the other side, people say, well, that's not part of this field, in this case, economics. And what I think is exciting about Bloom and Van Reenen and Sandun is they're saying, look, this really matters for economics, and that's why it's so important what people in business schools are doing in strategy and management. And I just think that's a good thing. So to me, this is among the most important research agendas in strategy right now, even though it's coming from people who are primarily in the economics field in some cases. And that doesn't mean that we can't all benefit from it. And there's lots of other folks in strategy and management who are building on this work as well. So I think that's exciting. So, Charlie, what's interesting then is there's a big debate on what's the news here. Right? What is new about what Bloom, Van Reenen, Sandun, and their co-authors are doing in the context of the long history of strategic management research? What's your sense of what's new here?
Well, they have this, and you can visit the website for this World Management Survey. And I would say the work that's come out of that has just what's new and has been really high impact is both the scale of what they're doing, the scope of what they're doing, and then the rigor of what they're doing. So those three things are really, really driving this kind of the top levels of economics, and I think are really going to speak to strategy as well. The scale, I would say, what they have with the World Management Survey is very detailed interviews with hundreds of plant and establishment managers around the world. So in tens of countries, if we take the data in some of these papers as representative. So, and what they look at there are basically how these firms approach goals. Do you have goals? Have you told anyone what these goals are? Do you measure targets based on these goals? Do you reward anyone for actually moving the firm towards these goals? So very, very basic things. But this is difficult to do around the world. They say at some point in here that every interview, so every 45-minute to 60-minute interview that they conduct in native languages, run by MBAs, speaking to practicing managers, costs about $400 per interview. So I just did a kind of a thumbnail calculation, just based on the count of firms that they mentioned in one of the exhibits. This $400 per interview, that's over $5 million into this survey. So there is real scale involved in doing this sort of work. Now, the scope is they have it across these many countries, and John Van Reenen has been through here at Bocconi a few times now to talk about this, and he can make nice comparisons between, say, Italy and the United States that really illustrate how important management is, but also some interesting variants between different countries. So one of the key things that he shows about Italy, not only does, when we look across the distribution of management practices, it's shifted a bit down. It's just the averages are all a bit lower than among equivalent U.S. firms. The big difference is that below a certain minimum, they generally average these firms out to like a 1 to 5 scale. Below about 2.0 in the United States, firms really just don't exist. If you're that bad, if you don't have goals, you aren't telling anyone about them, you aren't measuring them, then you don't exist pretty quickly. On the other hand, in Italy, there's a substantial number of firms that look like that, and that's even more true as you go to some other places that they've studied. India, Africa comes out the worst in these surveys. So the scope, they can go country by country and show basically that management practices, the average quality they find in their survey, is highly correlated with the overall productivity level of that country. And we know that's really associated with wealth and economic outcomes.
And Charlie, to jump in here for a second, right?
Go.
Is there an economic development lesson then from this work too that we should be thinking carefully about? Should we be subsidizing consulting around the world? Maybe one of the differences between rich and poor countries is to the point that Van Reenen, Bloom, and Sandun could make in management practices. And if we can improve management practices, we could have a huge impact on productivity and then wealth generation in these countries. So is that something that we should be thinking about? Not just in Europe, but in emerging markets like Brazil, Russia, India, and China.
Absolutely. And it's clear that public knowledge about management in this is very weak. So one of the striking findings is that managers' own assessments of the quality of their firm and how much they should invest in has no correlation with these outside assessments, none at all, which means good managers don't know that they're better than average, and weak managers also don't know. And this is, in fact, a huge barrier to the managers going out and actually learning more. So And in addition, what is best practice isn't really well known. So yes, I think in terms of investing in development, and there is a lot more focus on this. In fact, the World Bank was the co-sponsor of a large experiment that they did in India, which illustrated with randomized controlled trial that giving consulting practices, consulting services to a certain set of manufacturing firms actually increased their productivity substantially.
Yeah, and Charlie, I mean, this point about managers kind of not knowing, right, that they're behind, can be found in Gibbons and Henderson's work, which we're posting on the site as well. So in there, they talk about, why did these poorly managed firms persist, like the ones you talked about in Italy? And, there's a bunch of different reasons. You might think, one, that there's not sufficient motivation in terms of competition in the environment. You might think that they know they're behind, but they don't know how to improve, right? And there's not enough information on some of these practices. It also could be, right, that they don't actually know they're behind. And that's what I think is so interesting about some of these results when you break down what these authors and others are doing, is that you can actually test to see which one of these mechanisms is most acute, and then think about a policy intervention, which would have to be carefully designed, let's be honest, to think about sort of picking up management practices in these different places.
Yes, so true. It really could, and I think already has inspired additional experiments, especially in emerging markets. There's a lot of impact on people's thinking about development. What do you think about the work and strategy in general? How is work and strategy reacting to this new stream of research?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, one interesting working paper by my colleague at Duke, Victor Bennett, and my PhD colleague, Jason Snyder, who's now at Utah, is about decomposing some of these differences that Van Reen and Bloom and Sandun find. So they do a variance decomposition analysis. And what they find is that the differences within country are actually pretty large. And so across countries, you'll see basically very well run and then very poorly run firms in various countries. So there's a challenge not just across countries, as we talked about in the economic development angle, but also within countries. And I think Italy would be a great example to speak about, or all the focus that we've had on Greece, for example, and whether these, sort of measures that are being taken at the national and at the EU level are going to have an impact on some of those poorly managed Greek firms. And what's nice, I think, about this management practices surveys is, when the news comes out about Greek firms and German firms and Italian firms, we can actually go look at the work that Bloom, Van Reen, and Sandun and others are doing and sort of compare management practices across these countries. And we might be surprised by what we find, and some of the stereotypes might not always apply. So that's kind of what I like about having sort of this big data on management practices. I think that another interesting thing to think about here is, where this work is going to go. And I think two interesting streams of work that Rebecca Henderson is both kind of involved in. One with Sarah Kaplan, which looks at kind of cognitive explanations for why sort of managers at these poorly run firms aren't getting better. And then also, of course, the work that Rebecca's doing with Bob Gibbons about relational contracts and how hard it is to build things like trust in these relationships. So they give this great example at Nordstrom, right, where it basically, the employee manual boils down to using your best judgment. And you'd say, gosh, how does Nordstrom do so well with such a simple rule that is open to lots of different kinds of interpretation? And for Gibbons and Henderson, it's really about building those relational contracts over time, and that can take time. And maybe that's one reason why poorly managed firms are sort of behind for longer than we might think if we bought sort of neoclassical economic theory. So I think those two streams of work that Rebecca's involved in both kind of point us in different directions in terms of figuring out why is that gap between sort of the well-managed firms and the poorly managed firms so large and persistent. And I think for strategy scholars specifically, we've been thinking about these performance differences in the same way for a long time. And so there's just an amazing opportunity for us to apply some of those things now to look at management practices. I do think, though, Charlie, one group that's been kind of silent in this, and we haven't talked enough about, are the managers themselves. So what's the difference in your view between management practices and managers? And should we be really focused more on the individuals or the actual practices? And is that something that strategy scholars should be kind of teasing out more carefully? What do you think?
That's a really interesting and challenging question. I've been thinking about that partly through this idea we touched on before, that public sharing of practices really has great potential to move things forward, that if managers are more aware of where they stand in terms of where their quality level is, what they stand to learn, and what best practice is, those managers might make a big difference. But certainly in these in the studies, for instance, they actually, in these India experiments, they actually do look at what kept firms from adopting these practices. And they did find that the attitudes of top managers, the amount of time they had, and just generally their belief in whether these things would make any difference for their firm had a huge impact on whether they're adopted. So I think as far as understanding certain sets of barriers to the spread of best management practice, there's a lot we're learning here. I also think there's a lot that strategy and management work has already done that really will speak to that. There's, back to great work by Gabriel Shalansky on the stickiness of knowledge and best practice transfer within individual firms, and much work on knowledge transfer that's followed from that has a lot to say about why this is so challenging and why these things don't always transfer. Similarly, studies by Linda Argotti on learning have showed some of the limits on how learning transfers, say, between different franchises of a pizza joint or between different lines of production for boat production. And then finally, there's this issue. I said at the beginning that they kind of had a funny combination of naive and informed approach to management practices. There's kind of a big question, which I think it requires continued discussion about to what extent have they really captured universal management goods, that having goals, measuring, moving forward with them, and to what extent are they talking about things that are really contingent on the time, contingent on the cultural setting, contingent on the industry that you're in. Most, though not all, but most of their studies are very focused in manufacturing. There's a question that goes back to the old contingency theory, which they do engage with, in fact, but it's a bit of a straw man, I would say. But the contingency theory saying the best approach to organizing, the best structures for your firm, most notably, really depend on both your strategy, how much you're focused on either efficiency or innovation or differentiation of your products, marketing, that all those things may drive different sorts of managerial choices in different contexts. And here they're really trying to make a strong case for universal goods. And I think as we start to tease apart the survey, we'll find some elements really are universal and others are more context dependent.
Yeah, Charlie, on that, though, so two things that sparked in my mind. One is, the studies in India, which is a very different market from kind of the Western markets in the UK and the US that we've been talking about earlier. They look at some of these interventions where they actually sort of randomly assign consulting and bring these management practices to these these textile mills. And I think what they find is an increase in productivity in those plants. And that sort of speaks to maybe that there is some universality to some of these things, which I thought was interesting. I also wanted to say, look at our business school curriculums. You're in Europe now. We both spent time in Asia and, of course, here in the U.S. How different is sort of the core strategy class that we teach on these different continents? And now we have students from all around the world, including an increasing share from these emerging markets who are going to go back and manage some of these firms in some cases. I'm not sure we're using all these contingent theories when we teach, for example, the 5 forces or dynamic capabilities or whatever the chosen curriculum is. So, are we sort of buying into that universality in our own teaching, if not our research?
Yeah, that's very interesting. We probably are, and it's a slippery slope. As they sort of set it up in some of these papers, the contingency argument can be taken too far to say, well, each firm is already doing what's optimal for them, and we know that's not true. We know that's far from the case, and so there are some basic approaches to management that I think most managers and most businesses can really benefit from.
Well, this is certainly an area of research that is going to be continuing to generate exciting and important ideas at the the intersection of economics, strategy, and a variety of other fields. What I'd like to do is go into our last segment, and this is the part of the show that we call I Wonder. And this is where we propose, in rapid fire, one offbeat, funny, or just plain interesting research idea that has popped into our head recently. All scholars have them, but we have a podcast, so you get to hear them. Charlie, I'm going to let you go first. What have you been wondering about?
Well, what I've been wondering about recently with the announcement that Google's restructuring itself into Alphabet, as in Alphabet bets on big outcomes that really shift the the rewards, but into a conglomerate structure where the Google that we know, the search, ad, YouTube, video, information company, is going to be one division, while these other divisions that engage in really big, innovative bets, like on extending life, mapping genomes, self-driving cars, some of the sort of more fantastical things we know Google is pushing on, will be separate units. And the inspiration for this supposedly comes a bit from Warren Buffett and his conglomerate that's generated huge value from buying up public firms, getting better management in place, speaking of management practice. But I'm really wondering if this makes sense for these really innovative sort of skunkworks projects. A classic conglomerate structure has typically been much more successful in industries that are more established, like these sort of public-to-public transformations that Warren Buffett's been doing, or General Electric, in a lot of fairly established industrial businesses. So I'll be very interested to see, and I think there's really room for research on especially the capital allocation process and how this works when you're trying to balance across these much more established, profitable businesses and then these big, expensive bets on the future. Is there some capital allocation process that really can balance across those two, supporting each separately? This is both an old idea in the field, but I think it's coming back up again, that the interest in corporate strategy is sort of shifting away from managing synergies. People feel that's kind of been a bust, and back to how do corporate parents create value through good capital allocations and kind of monitoring and parenting, just the way Google is trying to approach things. So I think that's a really interesting strategic move. I'm a bit skeptical, but I think there's a lot of room for good research on it.
Yeah, whether it works or not, Charlie, I think the Google reorg is probably the biggest strategy story of 2015 in terms of the news so far. So I'll be watching it closely, and I think it's something that we should all weigh in on, whether it's blog post or podcast or through our academic work. For me, I've been wondering about something a lot more personal. Last time I talked about how we explain failure. Today, I'm interested in how we explain success. You know, there's a really interesting dynamic in American politics right now where we debate quite a bit about whether an individual is responsible for their success or whether the environment is. And there were classic cases where Senator Elizabeth Warren from Massachusetts talked about, the wealthy individuals in the factories not necessarily taking into account the road that was paid by public money that led to the plant. And others talking about sort of the famous quote about, "You didn't build that," and whether that actually described how we think about entrepreneurship and innovation and sort of the role of the individual in success. And I've been thinking about it a lot more in how we attribute success within organizations. If we see a successful manager who does well running a particular P&L, is it because of the manager or is it because of the environment? And I think it's a really interesting question, both in terms of trying to estimate these in careful empirical studies, which my colleague Sharon Bellinzone and Ulia Solomon at WashU and others are doing. But I also think it's just important to think about how we message these things inside organizations. Do you want to hire someone who really believes that they matter? Or do you want to hire someone who understands that the environment probably has more impact on how well they do than their own individual effort? And what's your theory of how success works? And what kind of person do you want in your next managerial role? So I've been thinking a lot about the right way to balance that in organizations, how we think about success, how much we attribute to ourselves, how much we attribute to the environment, and what kinds of people we want in these 21st century organizations like Google, for example. So that's something I've been wondering about, Charlie.
That's really fun. I sometimes in class put up a quote from a more honest than usual Nabisco executive who says, "Some genius invented the Oreo. We just live off the inheritance." And but I think that is a rare attitude out there in corporate America. Okay, so that brings us to the end of our second edition of Research Chatter. If you liked it and want to hear more, please subscribe in iTunes. You can search for Research Chatter and find us. It may be, I think it's still coming up a few levels down, but check us out. You can subscribe on iTunes, and please pass it on. If you liked it, let other people know about it and get them to sign up as well. The online home for the podcast we've established in last time will be the blog of the Strategic Management Society. You can find this blog at Strategic Management Society, run together as one word, strategicmanagementsociety.wordpress.com. If you want to check out specific papers that we mentioned, we'll link to them from the podcast post in this blog. You can also find us at the SMS Facebook page by searching Strategic Management Society in Facebook. And please comment or write to us. Let us know what you think. Have we learned anything from the new economics of management, or is economics reinventing the management wheel? You can find all our contact info at that same blog. That's strategicmanagementsociety.wordpress.com.
And don't forget to give us feedback on Twitter at strategic_MGMT. This is new. It's an experiment, and we're hoping you can tell us what you find most interesting and most useful. For now, thanks for listening, and see you next time.